You're listening to The Breakup Theory, conversations about ending things and collective liberation. In this episode, I speak with two beautiful trans writers, artists, thinkers, Nat Raha and Mijke. They recently published Trans Femme Futures with Pluto Books. Their book describes an expansive ethics of collectivity, care, and complicity from the perspective of trans femme knowledge and experience. Nat and Mijke developed the book over the last number of years through different iterations as a zine and a conference, but also as an offering from many years of organizing, not just for trans liberation, but for all people. In reading the book, I found you take on a slight altering in language as they inflect words we've used and think we know with a different tone. This creates a web of understanding that helps us find our position in the world differently from the perspective of trans femme ethics. One through line that I found incredibly important was their thinking of the idea of complicity. This attends to the leftist piety of purity, but also the guilt of enforced participation in state and capital. For them, complicity doesn't just mean, yeah, we're part of this terrible machine and we can't fully escape it. But as Mijke says it in our conversations, we start from what you do with your body in this world. And it's from this place that we can then figure out the dynamics of making collectives. It's a way to address our entanglements with power from all the different positions of vulnerability with the name of untangling hierarchical power for everyone. But beyond complicity, trans shows us we don't have to remain stuck in a world or a body not of our choosing. They tell us that trans does the unchoosing, and as Nat says, femme opens up worlds. We have a really in-depth conversation here. Nat and Mijke were very generous with their time. We weave together concepts and analysis from their book with Nat and Mijke's own personal histories of involvement in movements and community. I highly recommend reading Trans Femme Futures. They find a beautiful way of articulating what transness and femness can teach us about how to live. You can find it at Pluto Books or wherever else you get your reading materials. If you want to access more of my work, as well as the work of the wonderful Carla Joy Bergman, Danny Burleson, and Vicky Osterweil, you can sign up for our newsletter at kashinythings.com. If you subscribe, you'll also get access to all of our articles, our Discord server where we have discussion, movie nights, writing workshops, and book clubs, and more. Our podcast, advice column, and zine and sticker library are always free. Cause just put out an invitation for people to contribute to a piece we're constructing around the question, how do you love, how do we live? As we write on the website, the aim of our invitation is to deepen collective mutuality and connections because we know that when we feel more connected and a sense of belonging, our capacities increase, propelling us to show up and do and be more in the now and into the future. We want people to submit by either recording an audio file of up to 1 minute, and you can use the Breakup Theory hotline, 917-426-6548, or email a text up to 200 words to cod.shinythings@proton.me. Please just add how do you love, how do we live into the subject line. You can remain anonymous or include your name, whatever you want. And we would love all kinds of approaches and genres, so don't shy off of getting freaky if you want. For more information on this project, you can look at our Instagram post or take a look at the website. The Breakup Theory is a member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, which pulls together a wide variety of shows taking an anarchist perspective on culture, politics, actions, and more. Check them out at channelzeronetwork.com. All right, I'm here with two lovely people, Nat Raha and Mijke, who book Trans Femme Futures, Abolitionist Ethics for Trans Feminist Worlds, just came out with Pluto Books. It's an amazing book, and we're going to dive into it. But first, I'd like both of you just give a little introduction about who you are.
Hey, so my name's Nat Raha. My pronouns are she and her. I describe myself as a poet and activist scholar. I'm based in Scotland, and I've been kind of thinking about questions around transfeminism. I came up politically kind of through the anti-austerity movement in the UK in the early 2010s. That was the kind of moment of awakening for me, and then understanding that in relation to histories of anti-racist organizing in the UK that also kind of ignited in 2014 around BLM. And that's also kind of a similar time that Mijke and I started working together on our project around transfeminism, radical transfeminism, gave birth to a conference, a zine, eventually this book after a few years. Yeah, that's me. Mijke, do you want to go?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I usually try to keep my pronouns out of the public realm, which leads to the radical thing that all my students call me she somehow. I don't know. But I try to keep them out of print to just see what happens. And I think that has to do a bit because I moved to the UK. And well, before that, I grew up in the Netherlands. People used to call me she, but when I moved to the UK, everybody, like 80% of the people started to call me he because there's a style of gendering that I kind of bring that doesn't work here. And also I don't do the UK squeaky voice that a lot of women have because I didn't grow up in this misogynist culture, but in another one. So since then, I'm a bit like unanchored from my pronouns. It just sort of like drifts along. So as an activist, I think I came mostly out of the squat movement. I've squatted for a long time. Then from there, I rolled back into community organizing after I moved out of the place where I was squatting. I moved to the UK because I got fired from my PhD and then had to do a new PhD in the UK, which was a sort of like, it saved me, I think. So it was a bad thing that turned into, it got me out of the Netherlands, which was very helpful. But it got me also into a space where thought could happen. And it gave me the excellent opportunity to relearn organizing in a different space with different people. And like, okay, the English we speak on the continent of Europe is a fairly different kind of English than the English that is spoken in Britain. So you also have to do it in another language, right? Because I don't think they are the same languages, even though they're both like tap into English as a sort of baseline. Before that, I was like a dancer and a light technician. I started to go to a proper university quite late, which was also quite fun. So it was always a holiday for me, getting myself out of really boring jobs. And here in London, I've been doing many boring jobs. And now I am landed in a sort of like a reasonably good job, I think, where I'm chair of the union. So that means I sit endless hours in committees doing union work. It needs to happen. It's a form of labor that is just what the kids call reproductive labor.
Thank
Kids.
you. Thank you for the introductions. And I think maybe like a little bit later we can talk about trans and academia, but just getting into the book, I think it's really interesting the way that you create these constellations of words that are terms that we know from some places or that you borrow from really influential feminist thinkers, but then you're like kind of using them differently. And I think maybe, the definitions that I pulled out of transness that I thought was really interesting was like an affective change in the world, and then or moving away from an unchosen starting place to something else that's like an opening. I just wonder if you could expand a little bit on what trans means and like what femme means and the two together for you in this book. That's a big question, but
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so I think we've been working through this like formulation from Susan Stryker, which is what you quoted, Julie. And I think really thinking about trans as a verb, thinking about what it means to be engaged in practices that do the unchoosing or that go somewhere, and not just in this whole question in Trans Studies about the movement. Aaron Azira writes about this really well. But we're more interested in this about what it means to do certain things that become trans or are informed by transness in a way that is about the transformative change in the world. And that's partly to shift trans out of an identitarian thinking and to say trans practices are open to anyone doing them, and that it's through doing certain kinds of practices, through having certain modes of engagement in the world, that the kinds of social changes, transformation that we want to see or that we believe we're all kind of capable of. And obviously we're also like not prescriptive around what that looks like, right? Because it's thinking about it conceptually rather than thinking about it through ethics, rather than thinking about it as like trans is A, B, C, D, E, and F per se. I think with feminists, it's a little bit different. But yeah, that these are kind of open, that this grammar, like trans is a verb, trans is grammar, is kind of open. And I guess we're trying to also supplement a lot of the conversations around refusal that are already kind of there in radical and in abolitionist thinking, really. And in relation to femme or to feminist, I think it's a little bit different because it reveals something also about, for us, trans being this social, collective grammar through which the kinds of logics that we want to describe as trans emerge is through a social or through a collective or through a communal context. And that the skills and the learning of how to do these things comes through being in these contexts, through being in the world. And thus that's also the site of where the kinds of shifts in terms of like feminist relationality really kind of matter for us as well. And that's not to say that, we obviously write a lot about institutions, and institutions also have their own kind of monopoly on gender in different ways. I don't just mean gender clinics, I also mean institutions in terms of how gender gets encoded socially. But feminist is a little bit different because we really started thinking through these kind of like the particulars of both feminization, but also femininity as a gentle, chosen thing that we want to lean into, because it also is exciting and nourishing and engaging.
Yeah, I think there was one thing about femme that is for me, or maybe like two things, that for me quite precious about it. Like, I think on the one hand, I always understand masculinity as a form of intentionality, right? I am going to do things like this from now on, or this is how I am going to move into the world and try to make it better or whatever. But I think what feminist emphasizes is engagement with different relationalities, right? And so when you see the femme labor in activist spaces, you always see the people going around asking, hey, what do you feel? What do you think? Are you okay with what's going on? Like, hey, you seem a bit isolated. How are you? What are you doing? And I think that form of relationality makes feminist. So the feminist is less a certain policy directedness or a certain intentionality or a certain like coming out of yourself into the world, but it is more like connecting to the world and seeing how together you can give it a certain form. And I think that ties in with this version of transness. And I really like that Nat said, yeah, everybody can do trans. And I think what we wanted to break a bit was the sort of weird binary between cisness and transness. Because I think a lot of quote unquote cisness people are just making their gender also on a daily basis. I mean, Judith Butler spelled his house already. And then the transness becomes then a bit like, oh, you broke out of the binary and now something is going on. And it is very bodily, that is often quite visible, but it is not necessarily medicalized, right? And I realized that one of my friends, Rafael Guri, is a theater maker, and he was making a play about transness. And that was through Dionysos. And I was for friends, I was in an exhibition made by Hugh Locke in the British Museum. And afterwards, we were looking at the loot, all the things that the people that they have stolen from everywhere. And I go past the vitrine and I go like, hey, this is trans person. And then I look and it's a statue of Dionysos, but anything in the body screamed trans at me, and it is like, it is an affective shift, and it's an affective shift that is cast in bronze over 2,000 years ago. And it is really clear. So that is what I mean. It is with a relationality, affective, and this thing that it is trans is therefore not like what certain forms of critical theory might want, that you make it a category or you can pinpoint it down, but it is relational. It is something that we do in specific environments, and it's very different in London than in Amsterdam or Berlin, or whether we go to Italy or Greece. You're seen constantly in different constellations and move in different ways.
And there's something in there about the aptitude of all the language recognition so overdetermined, right? It's like gaydar, right? It's like gaydar isn't just working at a level that's visible. It's also operating in this like, oh, there are these other spaces where there are these other elements that you tune into about a person's comportment or way they're existing in the world. And sometimes that's about body and dress, but not, it's also about everything that's in excess of that. And
and listening to it, no?
I think this is the thing that's happening around. Actually, it's interesting that you begin with the pronouns. Mijke always has this really good thing about, that the pronouns divert from paying attention to Mijke as a person. And next to that is also this thing of like, you start seeing this in terms of, there's loads of people who would use they, them pronouns who probably wouldn't necessarily identify as non-binary. And so what does that also mean about this? Where is the lines of gender norms that are being unmade through the kinds of grammars that non-binary and trans have opened up to people? That is also like, we don't want to defend our ground. That's literally what the transphobes are doing. They're trying to defend something against this crisis of gender that they've decided to panic over. And they think is like the end of moral end of white supremacist European society, turns out. Huh.
And I think the opposite
sounds pretty good.
Sounds pretty good.
No, definitely. But I think the opposite is with the trans umbrella, it cannot be large enough, right? And I think that is in that sense a very good training ground, because anybody can just place themselves under it and we just like, okay, welcome, let's go. And I think that is really, And there is sometimes you see the bit of disgruntlement and but then it's about speaking power. Like who gets to speak, quote unquote, for transness, and what kind of experiences do they bring? And I think that is partly what her book says. Like, wait, you don't get to. Everybody is welcome, but you don't get to speak in the name of the category. You have to speak out of your bodily being in the world. And I think that is for us very important. It's about what you do with your body in this world. What kind of experiences do you bring? What kind of relations do you make? And how do you comport yourself vis-a-vis the institutions that you're part of or not part of, right?
There's a bunch that I want to pull out of there. But first, starting with the kind of idea, this like openness of transness. I like that gaydar idea because like I always, when I see people, always like, oh, that person is definitely gay, even if they're not like identifying that way. Or you can see like the potentiality of gayness or transness in people, whether they're living it out or not. And I like that because even within trans communities and like trans academic communities, I see this kind of pushing towards a more definitional approach that's exclusive of, non-binary or anyone who isn't like medicalized in a particular way, and that seems to me, even though I understand it, because you don't want to lose the access that is necessary for many trans people, it seems to be like replicating a right-wing kind of idea. So this thing that you say in the book about trans liberation being form, not content. And that's a move away from, a trans politics that is saying like, we want this, 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 and this is really helpful. And I think that's what sort of you were saying in kind of verbing it. You also say that trans feminism is how we get together. And like, that's the form, right? Is the how. I guess that's what you were talking about in terms of relationality. So I don't know if you have thoughts on what I was just saying, if you want to expand a little bit more on how liberation is a formal thing, not something that has, specific kind of content to it, or the howness of trans feminism.
Yeah, if I kick off, I think the form is partly because we're thinking about forms of life, right? How do we do things? And I think both of us are part of more than one form of life. And then, of course, there's the institutional dances that you have to participate in. So you're also shifting forms, you're shifting sometimes languages, you're shifting forms of legacy understandings. And I think this is what makes it important rather than say you have to fit the program. And one of the things that I like so much about transness, and I think this is also what came out of like our conversations together when writing the book, like we've been doing public transness for a very long time, like over a few decades, right? And I'm honestly not doing the same things. I can show you the photos like that I was doing in the 90s in a squad bar, or what I was doing in the early 2000s when I changed my name and when I just got on hormones. And now it just shifts a lot, and it shifts not only because you have been doing things for a long time. And I think that has a certain resonance. Like I remember like when Trans Kids Deserve Better, it is a youth action group here in the UK that sprung up in quite a literal way, actually, after the Cass report.
Yeah, like last year.
Yeah, last year. And they occupied the grades in front of the Department for Education. And then we showed up and they were like literally like, oh, wow, they're teenagers and had never seen a trans person our age. And they were like really blown away by it. And it was mutually like super exciting because they had super fresh ideas and they wanted things and didn't want things. And there were very different things than I would want. And they are not more right than I am, right? Because it is more like, oh shit, this is how the shape of your world is. And this is how the shape of my world is. And I think that joyful exchange is very important. But what's also important that within transness, within us doing trans in different environments, the form of our life and our insights shift very much. Because what you see when you just come out is just very, very different from when been around the block for a few times.
Yeah, and that these things are always in relation to each other as well, right? That it's like actually the actions of of trans youth now do have an effect on us as trans adults, right? This is like both in terms of the kinds of political strategies they adopt. I spent a lot of time being like, where did trans kids deserve better get that strategy and tactics from? I was like, damn, these kids are on it, And it's also they're also coming up through a different kind of activist history than maybe we were at that age or a bit older, where at least when I was in my early 20s, the kind of strategies that were most visible to me were really liberal ones, right?
Yeah.
And because no one was doing anything that radical, at least in LGBTQ organizing, even in London at that moment. Or if there was, it wasn't super visible to us in certain ways. Or it wasn't institutionalized, I should say, right? As in, it didn't have this is also the struggle, right? That there's this, on the one hand, there's an absence of any kind of institutional history of queer trans activism in life that's at all political in the UK after the 80s. There's a lot of stuff around Section 28, but it's kind of it, which was the anti-gay law that was passed by the Tories. You couldn't talk about, if you were in the public sector, you couldn't talk about homosexuality as a quote unquote pretended family relationship. And this is from the 1988 until 2003, which is 2003 is when I finished school, right? So yeah, this lack of institutional history also just means that you've learned things a different way. And also we know that all the means of trying to do community educating are also informal or not very well funded, or they exist for a bit and then they disappear,
Yeah, the financialization of society had kicked off way more than for me, because I was 10 years earlier than you, and I came into a squatting movement where we did everything without money. We stole our shit, and you could pull it out of the ground by simply squatting something. But squatting was squashed by the time that you started to do this thing. So you came into it in a very, very different moment in time, I think.
I think it's more about how a radical history gets encoded, how communities share their knowledge of radical history. And to say that the trans community that I kind of came into in the mid to late 2000s had some of that historically, in terms of people like Ros Keaveney having this history of being involved in self-organized stuff in the 70s and 80s. But there was nothing that was live at that moment, right? And then for us, that, for me at least personally, that learning all kind of comes because the anti-austerity movement was using, say, squatting as a radical tactic to develop social space, it was around the time they criminalized squatting in public of residential buildings in the UK. That was in 2012. But there were lots of self-organized spaces in commercial buildings. They were really key in that, that was where we did a lot of queer info sharing and education as well. And how does that come back to these questions around form and content and forms of life? There is the sense of what are the possibilities of different forms of worlds? I think also, neoliberal creep, I think even for the generations that I see coming up after me or whatever, I'm in my late 30s now, right? I've been around for a while, and in trans years, that's what I mean, been around for a while. You see the model of the neoliberal entrepreneurial subject being just the norm rather than an aspirational norm that is grind culture. And then you see next to that is actually also there's loads of really incredible community organizing that's emerged, not just in response to that, but kind of in relation to that even as well, or in the same moment. The radical movements of the last few years have had a really significant impact in terms of what people feel is possible. Because next to this politics of assimilation, or not even politics, practices of assimilation, of trying to do the respectability socially, is then flipped by this no, actually our subculture fucking matters, and we're going to defend that ground and build it and make it for each other. Because the kinds of forms of life that emerge through that are really important next to the other options, which are all of the privatized forms of living that we're also still kind of. So it's this weird flip of on the one hand, sure, plenty of people got married for strategic reasons, but plenty of people also did it out of love and respectability and because it was a norm open to them. And then the flip is that 10 years on, people are this isn't very good, because all the material stuff still sucks. And actually we need other forms of life to make our lives livable, especially in a moment of cultural backlash and censorship and attack.
What I'm hearing, moving from the beginning of a kind of individual experience of relationality to the historical, is thinking about the history of a person and then the history of these movements. And one of the things that I've thought a lot about is that, because we're tracing from the 70s to the 80s, and 80s is a kind of dip, that the 70s gay and women's movement, as they moved towards status and assimilationist tactics, gave up on youth liberation and family abolition, which I think is really coming back now.
Yeah.
And that means that like there were a lot of people, and I think that particularly actually came out in the exclusion of trans people. Like that's one of the practical consequences of these movements, like kind of dropping those aspects. And as we see like more young people coming in today, I think there is this kind of split where like they see very clearly that the things they're promised don't exist and aren't available to them. Though there are still these forms of protest that they go to first because that's like the most dominant form. So they have like this radical perspective that they've lived through, not just learned. But then I think like there still needs to be kind of innovation. And I think that the youth do bring that often. So we have to think as we're like kind of older trans people, like how we relate to them, to like bring some history that's important, but like stay open to some of the innovations that they are willing to do. And I think that also plays out in the kind of transness that you're talking about. A friend of mine, this was really helpful for me, was talking about the experience of, getting on hormones, that your desire changes through the process of transition. So the thing that you think you want when you start shifts because you're doing something, right? Like something's happening. And that's maybe helpful to think on this kind of historical level as trans youth are brought in after all the supposed liberal wins of the gay movement, seeing the kind of crumbling of that.
Yeah, but I think if you also engage intergenerationally or engage in any way across different perspectives, I mean, if one person is not learning anything, the other person is also not learning anything. So that is really a classic, I think. So I'm a bit hesitant with saying like, oh yeah, the old people bring the history and the young people bring the innovation. I know that's not what you mean, but it's a bit like, I think the cool thing about the trans movement at the moment is that we're changing together and we're both learning from each other. And I think this is the fun thing. And then of course that is not a universal, because obviously there are trans people that don't learn anything and they don't want to learn anything. And they think they know how it wants and they want to be liberal, some of them. And then there's people that just want to be the new prophet and they just race off by themselves and they hope that there's a few followers. And so we see this whole kind of like weird mix of things going on. But the most beautiful moment that we can see is when the meeting happens and when people allow other people to change themselves, especially when that's mutual, right? Of course, that you allow people in. And I think that's the beauty of this moment in the trans movement.
Yeah. And okay, so it's also important to remember what is in the history lesson, right? I think one of the things, I just got Tourmaline's biography of Marsha P. Johnson and kind of dipped into it a couple days ago. And, it's a reminder, it's like, Sylvia Rivera was like very, very young, right? When all this stuff is happening, when Stonewall's happening, like Star were part of the youth movement of gay life. And like the selling out of youth is also the selling out of trans people and of radical gay liberation, capital L politics by a more liberal movement, right? Is also to sell out the kids and say, oh, your demands are too radical. The kinds of arguments made against trans youth now they're different, but they're also really familiar, right? Like I figured out I was trans pretty young, came out as a teenager. The thing I always got when I was like 14, 15 coming out, it's like, oh, but you're so young. How do you know? How can you be sure? What if you change your mind? And it's like, actually, this whole thing is about the disqualification of forms of knowledge that youth have, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And we also know, like, if you think about like what's the cultural impact of punk, right? All of this is how to throw the forms of respect, conformity that are reasonable, right? That's what the youth movement does. It challenges those things. And so it also, this goes like, I could easily talk about like, oh yeah, how this is about a counter respectability politics or reasonableness, and think of a poem by my friend Josie Giles, which is about the reasonable people, and insert all the logics of neoliberal politics here. But like to go back to the book is to think like, oh, this is part of the risk of transness, right? We want to say like, you've got to be willing to give up stuff, and part of it is that sure, you transition, your desires might change, And also, and then, we might be talking about sexual desires. We might be talking about who you're attracted to. We might also be talking about what you want to do with your body or your life.
Yeah.
And we might also be talking about, the next to that is you have to be willing to, the degree of social abjection that you might experience. A, that's going to change as the tides of culture change,
Mm-hmm.
But B, also, it might be way more extreme than you ever could have imagined. And so you've got to be willing to risk. I mean, that's the risk, right? It's like you kind of got to be willing to risk everything because every little bit is some kind of risk. But in that form of release is also to release some of the elements of the forms of life that you might be encumbered by. That's not to say you're risking all of your forms of life because because that's the forms of like the social worlds that we find ourselves in if we're in radical community. And that's not just leftist community, right? That's radical communities, like, or as abolitionists, or like, we're here because we've got each other, right? We're trying to refuse these forms of divisions and these divides between us. We're trying to say, no, like, we're here for you in the long term. And I think sometimes even it's like, hey, like, even if we don't check in for a year, like, I'm still going to be here in a year, We just have to pick up the phone. It's still there. But hey, maybe we didn't just check in for like a few days, but I'm still here, And I think that's the thing that I found really interesting because I was thinking about some people who I know who've transitioned recently but are older and are doing it with a much different kind of material basis than folks who transition young, where you haven't got access to income or, maybe you don't have support, maybe you're crowdfunding, maybe your resources are coming from your community. People who are doing it older are like, oh, I never had community before and I came out as queer and now I have community, And that's the difference, right? Which is like, oh yeah, because we've got each other, because there's a space that you have to be in to make sense of this. And that isn't always in person, but in terms of how it feels in person, it's really different. And that's one of the powerful things. Like I met some folks who are they've got a Scotland group, Transcristative Surf at Scotland, who are doing an action the week we're recording actually, because it's Edinburgh Pride this weekend. But when we met them at a demo against the Blockers ban that was held in Glasgow at the start of this year in January. And their two representatives had literally traveled from either side of Scotland. Like one's in Oban on the west coast, which is a town of like 5,000 people. The other's in Aberdeen, which is like the oil capital by the North Sea. And they're like, we're the whole organization so far. It's just the two of us. And they've traveled to Glasgow, which is like 2.5 hours to be there. And that's like, okay, cool. These are the moments that is coming together. This whole degree of connectivity has a lot of power in it. And yeah, I know there's something really interesting in that and thinking about how, what forms of organizing actually also kind of emerge, even in this total corporate capture of all of our means of communication, which is wild.
Yeah, I think one of the things that when you're talking about holding on to each other, I think one of the things that reminded me of that we started to think through femme when we brought out the radical transfeminism zine in the first time, because we were so constantly confronted with that disposability that femmes and especially then trans femmes became so disposable in certain scenes. And that we were like working against it to say like, how do we stop that disposability from happen? How do we hold each other in? And I think that is the wider trans movement, like how do we hold each other together? But also it was for us a starting point that was very clearly tied to abolitionist politics. So abolitionist politics was less a sort of ideological wind that started to blow from the other side of the ocean. But it was way more something that was constantly noticeable on the ground, that we saw people being pushed out, we saw people being ignored, we were ignored, overruled. And then we started to work on that. Like, what does it mean? What does it mean to take each other seriously? And what it also does is that accountability becomes a very, very different thing, because a lot of accountability is a punishment culture where you don't take each other seriously. And we started to flip it around, like, hey, what if we take each other, like, and that is from physicality, because the big problem is that a lot of people want to try to say the right thing, but it's very difficult if you go organizing this weird food co-op thing with a meal and it doesn't always work out and it's just a bit shit, which is always what happens in organizing, right? But then what matters if you start to give people the space to say the true thing, which is often much more hard. It is way harder that people feel held and safe enough that they start to describe in collectives what they see happening. And I think when you can get to that moment, change can happen. And I think with the description of younger trans people or people coming out, they describe themselves in terms of truth. Because transness, if one thing, it's always about the truth claim. Like, this is who I am, this is what.
You pulled out more of what seemed like a binary that I was making of like young and old, but so at risk of doing another one, the way that you conceive of femme as this one aspect of transforming the world versus the kind of directionality of what you were saying about masculinity. I see that in the movements a lot. We don't maybe necessarily need to gender it, but like one point, like people are so focused on like a goal and getting there and the action that you take towards it versus like, the kind of feminized labor of coming together and making a world. And I found it really interesting in the book you talk about, like in one perspective that we look at the history of the movements of the 20th century, or, even further back, that it's a history of failed rebellions, right? And that like you can overemphasize the failure, but you kind of shift perspective in a way that I'm trying to understand and think more about. Because like there is that history maybe of failures, but at the same time, there's something underneath that, right? That you were talking about. It's kind of a different way of approaching transformation, or like the emphasis that you put on collective. One of the ways that I've wondered about it is like, do you need this like organizing point, right? Like in the encampments here around Gaza, it was like the organizing point was to get the university to divest, which like I didn't think was achievable or even a really good goal. But within that process, they were making life together on the ground in the encampment and learned something very practical from that. So I was wondering, because this is something I'm trying to figure out, like to what extent do you think you need this overarching thing that like becomes the failed rebellion in order to do that femme work of collective making?
I'm not sure if I can answer the direct question of do you need a failed rebellion? I think one of the cool things about, like for instance, the rise of transphobia in the UK, I located around 2012 a column by Julie Bindel in The Guardian, the sort of lefty newspaper, where she made some nasty comments about trans people. Suzanne Moore jumped to her defense in that same paper. And in a way, it made things worse, right? Because there was a sustained attack since then on trans people. On the other hand, what that sustained attack did is it allows us to spread so much knowledge about trans people and trans lives and trans getting together. And I think that is sometimes ignored, that these pressure points allow us actually to spread out. But what is also often, So I teach one course in an art and design school, and artists especially, and I think most people in most higher education, unfortunately, are trained to become management. And we see that in art and design school, that people want to come into a community, solve a problem with the help of art and design, and then fuck off again. And we teach a course that they are not allowed to do this. The only thing they're allowed to do is meet the people that they're going to meet and learn that they will be met as well. And I think when we talk about the encampments, and I really like the example, I think one of my former students, actually a Philly native, worked with me as a student and then as a fellow in the RCA where I teach. And they did a research here asked by Innova, one of the sub-organization of the Stuart Hall Foundation, the British cultural theorist. And they made a research about the encampments in Britain. And one of the things that they learned, and I'm very impressed by that, is that the more of a goal the encampment had, like we need to get this specific university to divest, the more the group fell apart. And that the more the people that started to be the negotiators drifted apart from the group and lost touch. And then you see that in other encampments, they were like, you know what, maybe we can't reach our aims. What's more important is that we'll hold on to each other. And then you see an entirely different style of encampment where people take their political education very seriously. They take each other very seriously. They take it very seriously that everybody feels there and present and feels safe enough to be present. And I think these are the two different styles that are very important. And I don't say, oh, we should go aimless. That's not always good. But when it happens that you see some of the quote unquote negotiators or something run away and get detached from the movement, you know that the movement is going in the wrong direction. And when I was a negotiator, before I pass it to you, Nat, so you know it's going to come. When I was a negotiator with management, we had one of our strategists was making the decision. So we as negotiators could never be the runaway crowd that were the important people of the movement. Because as soon as in a movement there's important people, you have to help them give their power away. And so that they stay part of the crowd and stay part of the collective, because that is the most important in those movements.
So I'm going to jump in, and I guess I'm going to try and think about the questions from a slightly different angle, which is to say, how do we define failure? What's its temporality? Because even I think thinking about divestment movements, right, there are still projects to try and get these universities to divest, right? We might feel that an encampment failed in its goal during the life of an encampment that's now finished, but we see that retroactively. Obviously, it's different in the ground in that moment. But maybe my example to think through this is like to try and contradict what Mijke said around 2012 as this moment, which is to say, so in 2008, the biggest trans protest in the UK that had happened at that time took place, and it was about 200 people turned up to protest Stonewall UK's award ceremony because they were giving an award to a transphobic journalist that Mijke just named. And that, and it was like 200 trans people, there's like 10 TERFs turned up or whatever as a counter protest. And you could say, okay, so what was the failure in that moment is that Stonewall gave their award to this transphobic journalist, right? And then it's like, this story doesn't make any sense from the contemporary. It makes sense in terms of transphobia, but then it's like, oh wait, but what happened is, so it's 2008, Stonewall later, they firstly were not really into gay marriage, and then they had a U-turn and they were like, actually, no, cool, we'll do gay marriage. Yeah, let's do that. And then gay marriage got legalized and they were like, great, that was us. Well done, us. And they turned around and they were like, but what's the deal? You weren't here until like a year ago. And they're like, well, turns out feminists don't like gay marriage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then after that, they're like, maybe we need to rethink the trans thing, So it's like 2014, they had this whole community consultation. I was pissed. I was so pissed. I wasn't involved in the community consultation. All my friends were, whatever. The flip side of this, let's go back to this 2008 story. For me personally, I was 21. I turned up to this demo. It's the first time I've been to a trans demo. I literally meet my BFF for life after the demo. I can remember like what I was wearing. I remember I came after my work. I had a minimum wage job working at my student union. And it's like, if these things hadn't happened and this circumstance hadn't come together, maybe my entire relationship to trans politics would have happened in a different way. And that's to say, okay, and that's just individual. And then I think about the people who were there on that night, both in terms of this mix of this kind of liberal activist culture. Sure, this is part of this liberal activist culture that we're talking about. But then this long game of being like, okay, so now in the 2025, Stonewall are like the only LGBT organization who have resourced enough to really fight to put trans education on the table in schools, say. I don't think they're the solution. I definitely don't think they're doing all the work by any means. But it's like that turnaround from like 15 years ago, whatever, 20 years ago, is like, it says something about like, this is the long-term attempts to try and shift these things. Even though, and it also is like, the whole like TERF discourse problem was already a problem there, and it was already still a fucking throwback to Janice Raymond at that point, right? And now it's kind of differently organized and there's different things happening, sure. But that's one event. It's different to like an encampment that's part of a movement that's trying to do things. But all these events have some kind of life if we want to narrate them or if we remember them in relation to the kinds of movements that emerge later.
I think one of the things that is also maybe part of that story, and not of the story of 2008, but of the story of around 2012, is that Sheila Jeffries, who was in Australia, became a pensioner, and the Australian government refused her residence permit. And she grudgingly didn't want to, had to relocate back to the UK, but lost all her friends and all her life. And she started to call back the Leeds feminist group of which this journalist was a part. And that is the moment that the journalist really flipped and became very, very publicly transphobic. So there's also a weird story there about academic coming into renewed isolation and kicking something off there.
It's interesting. It always seems like the trans reaction to attacks is like new for the people who are coming into it, but it's just like repeated, and it's not like they've developed any new ideas going back to Janice Raymond. It's like the same talking points, but it like will take up more attention and it brings new people into it, but you can keep pushing it further back. to see where it originates. But this is kind of weird that I brought up the encampments as an idea, because what you talk about in the book is really this like transliberalism that's focused around rights claims, which I think could function like this kind of, organizing element, versus the trans liberation that is like this collective work that isn't oriented towards this one simple gain, or like it's a form, not a content, like you said. And I guess maybe this is a place that we can like shift into the critique of identity politics that comes through and in your book. And I think that you use some really interesting terms to get at it, which I think also touches kind of anxieties people have about living in this world. Because like this main word that is the refrain through the book is complicity. This is a question that I always get when I'm like teaching new people about the state and capitalism, is like, how do we do anything without being part of it, right? And you don't make that an expectation. Like maybe you can talk a little bit about the way that you conceive of complicity, and it's like in relationship to separability as part of the kind of structure of our society. And yeah, so complicity is something that's not necessarily a failure.
Yeah. I'm still kind of stuck on the last point as well. I'm just like, wait, is there something to say about how transphobic feminism's institutionalization is also why it's cyclical, that it's stuck in this cycle of reproduction that institutions need in order to present themselves as ahistorical also? I wonder if there's something there to think through more.
Yeah, that's another point in your book, is sort of the use of gender politically to do certain things at certain times.
Yeah, we could go back to the gendering of certain forms of engagement with the world, certain kinds of approaches as well. Okay, so complicity. Complicity kind of became, or it emerged as like a key subject in the conversations we were having quite early on in the development of the book. So we're thinking about it in terms of, if you haven't read the book, if you're listening at home and you haven't read the book yet,
Yes.
we're thinking about this mix of, on the one hand, this kind of classic definition of complicity is like, oh, we all belong to these nation states, say. These nation states are involved in arming a genocide or enacting a genocide, say. And like, as a result, we're all complicit as citizens. Sure. Which obviously we're there, and we think about the grammar of pro-Palestine solidarity movements where I am, where like solidarity, not complicity, is the slogan that people are running with, right? But next up, we're like, actually, is there something more interesting to think about in actively claiming complicity and thinking about how positioning oneself as involved and entangled and engaged, even if you're in a position where you have comparative little power, say in relation to institutions, but through that positioning, it opens up a different kind of agency in terms of what actions one can undertake and how.
I think, surely, by how you said the refrain of complicity as being part of it, I think I really like that formulation. And it was like, yeah, that's such a good summary, because wherever you are, you're part of it, even if you don't want to, or even if you hold a bit of a distance to it. But I think one of the things we wanted to really get rid of, and here we have to really thank Jackie Wang, right? Jackie Wang wrote in the Lies magazine, The Against Innocence, which was, I think, very, very foundational for me. At that moment, it really like, oh yeah, wait, hold on a second. We're not going to do innocence. And then Gloria Wekker came with White Innocence, that book. And then it also, of course, appeared in Dutch. Witte Onschuld. And so we have the problem of innocence. But if you take the problem of innocence so seriously and you give it the due it's supposed to have, and you look at the structure of political thinking that we use, we see that it's the structure of critical theory. It's very good at indicating limits and limiting conditions, but it also makes the indicator innocent, because the indicator disappears with the use of these tools of indicating limits and limiting conditions. And we didn't want that. We were saying like, no, what if we do that against innocence like all the way? Then you are part of the situation. And then, for instance, you might indicate, oh yeah, this famous professor abused his power, and because of that, certain things of harassment happened in universities, because they do happen in universities and often in this pattern. But what we also see is that some other people still use that famous academic status. So they are part of a certain atmosphere. And while this is a form of the more classical form of complicity, where, hey, maybe you're part of the problem if you want to tap into famous people politics, right? So how do you give your power away? Tina Turner is one of our secret dramaturgs in the book because, of course, we don't want another hero, but we're also strong claimants of we're simply the rest. So because we don't want to be better than anyone, right? So, and that is part of the other side of that complicity is to say like, we are simply the rest, like you, me, all of us, we're all struggling to make the best of it. And we have all kinds of things have happened to us, all kinds of privileges that we also have. And at the same time, it's pointless to admit guilt. And it's also pointless to sort of pretend it's not there. It's just there and we're going to work with it.
I'm going to jump in and say that, so it's also this thing of, okay, so there's a response to that, which is like, oh, but what about hypocrisy? What does it mean to have a political position and then do the complete opposite thing? And that's not to say that, think about, if we're talking about complicity with genocidal, neoliberal, authoritarian capitalism at this point, right? It's like, we're still saying divestment is important. Like, obviously, it's, there's a material analysis that matters. But next to that is to say there are also, I don't want to say there's limits to that, but there is to say like, there's always more that we could be doing. And to not just turn that as a moral imperative upon oneself that lapses into guilt and anxiety, but to say like, okay, that's a recognition of where we are, power, what material relations one is within, that is, you could describe as acknowledging one's privilege, that you could call it that, but maybe it's also more than that too. And from there, and maybe this comes back to thinking about separability, right? Which is to say, like, I'll get into this, is say, like, okay, so what can I do from where I am, which is this thinking about one's local in relation to the global and thinking about, okay, so what are the particular networks of complicity that one might find oneself within? And simultaneously acknowledging that the kinds of social worlds that we are also critical of and we identify in the book, especially thinking about separability, right? That we're also in those worlds as framed by the structure that we're critiquing. And we simultaneously need to find strategies to dissolve, which might be strategies of solidarity, but there might be other they might be things that we don't so easily label as solidarity. And so to talk about separability is to say, so we make this argument that separability is an overarching dynamic of contemporary Europe. We kind of are writing from Denise Ferreira da Silva out of this. Denise was writing about people drowning in the Mediterranean, trying to migrate to Europe as part of the anti-Black logics of Fortress Europe, anti-migrant xenophobic logics of Fortress Europe. And that's only become more intensified, right? Because now it's like this desire to close borders as far as you can, criminalizing being refugees. And meanwhile, we've got this kind of like war economy that's gone into overdrive. That's the new vogue in Europe, right? We can't rely on Trump, so we got to do, what if NATO no longer exists? What the fuck are we going to do? And so these dynamics of separability, they're also they have an echo of the classic colonial divide and rule. But we're also trying to say like, this is also the structure of our self-organized communities, Even the people who are doing like anti-immigration race organizing still may be struggling with whiteness as this part of the structuring principle. And that might be influencing how they do solidarity. It's important that we can fucking recognize and name that, because that's actually how we start trying to undo those things, Because so much of this is also thinking about like cultures of whiteness within self-organized spaces, right? Or cultures of transmisogyny and transphobia, or cultures of ableism. Like these are all these kind of things that are at play. And it's way easier if we can say, sure, the space isn't accessible, but we can say, hey, yeah, like we could do fucking better. And maybe some days we don't have the energy to do the bare minimum, and that fucking sucks, And we're all fucking guilty. Like, I don't mean like we're all complicit, but it's like, sure, but that's also the invitation for us to try and work on all those things, do all those skills, wear a fucking mask, Like we all did that for 2 years. Why can't we continue doing it now? All these are practices of community safety. And like, it comes back, I think this question around innocence is also, it's situated in like, what does abolition feminism really bring to the world, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is really important to underline there is that Denise talks about difference without separability, right? So it is not just the structure of separability, but the difference without it. So I think that is linked to complicity. It is sometimes when you get them together in a space, it is very important to acknowledge the different differences without having to collapse in a sort of identity structures, right? Where the identity structures are used to keep us apart, rather than being in the space as a way that we can acknowledge our differences or the bodily histories that we bring and still be there together. And I think that is very important. And I think that complicity is part of it, to say like, hey, we are part of it because we are together in this space. And sometimes that also means, and we have also seen it with quite successful grassroots organizations that become kind of run by a friend group. And the friend group, the core of that organization, is so tight and they're so cliquey and have such a good time. And then there's this circle of people around it that cannot really get in touch and that feel that they're not really part of the collective anymore. And they feel a bit on the side. And I think at that moment, it doesn't matter how cool you are and how well and the differences are held. The point is that it became closed. And that you have to find as organizers a way, again, how to dissolve certain power, how to give something of the closure up. And it means also styles of organizing. You have to give it up so that people can get involved in it. Or you have to help people to transform out of the organization and do another organization with skill sharing and what have you. You know, there's also different things that are possible, but it is not just thinking through the traditional identity structures and look at separability there, but also to see, because that is the call Denise makes on us, how can we do ethics that acknowledges difference without separability? So how can we get together in a space without closing ourselves off?
I'd add that there's something, on the one hand, it can sound kind of utopian, but then we're also trying to keel back from framing it as just utopian, right? That in the conditions of unmaking separability, difference becomes, the potentiality of difference expands.
Yeah, because it's anti-patriarchal, because we do write about it, right? Because patriarchy will always try to purify and unify on the basis of a purification. And I think what difference without separability invites us is to exactly the opposite, is to come together without purification.
You talk about that ethics as a negotiation of difference. And one of the ways that I understood what you were talking about in the book and also just now, that was a really helpful expansion on classic ideas, I guess, classic at this point. But contrary to the idea that complicity, not solidarity, we can say that complicity allows for solidarity. And it's like the Kathy Cohen argument in Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens is that, like, if we get beyond this attachment to identity, then we can make strange bedfellows in our organizing that you wouldn't necessarily think would share the same goals. And that becomes a question of positionality, like what your position is in relationship to power. Going back to, you know, the examples of the encampments and then also like sort of trans liberation versus trans liberalism, this is one of the ways that I was trying to approach it, is like, the encampments they had a material goal of divestment, but are also enacting a material threat in the moment, right? Which is why it called for such a big violent repression in the US, at least. And similarly, I see, like, you know, there's trans rights, which are maybe necessary for, you know, daily existence for a lot of people, but there's something else which I'm interested in, is that, like, trans is a material disruption of the world that is trying to be controlled in various ways that, you know, won't be solved by rights. So how do we lean in? This is like my, you know, in the encampments, I was like trying to get my encampment group to lean into the disruption. Like, how do we lean into these things? I think the place from which you see your material disruption of the world is a certain kind of positionality in relation to power, a position within that is complicit, right? That's not outside and attacking it. To make this into a question, you brought up way earlier, Nat, refusal. And I think that maybe this is kind of verging on that idea. So, and this is, you know, the breakup theory. I'm very interested in breaking up and refusals. Maybe you can talk about, like, how you see refusal playing into this sort of ethics and negotiating of difference.
Because I'm still thinking about some of the stuff around the encampments, thinking about how, like, some of the struggles around divestment really are still live, like at Glasgow Uni, which isn't where I work. But I've encountered some of the students recently, and, you know, they're still really struggling on these questions of divestment, or still pushing for them. And there are also just some, like, incredible home truths to get immersed in the context of that. So Dr. Ghassan Abusita, who's a British Palestinian surgeon, who was the person who stood up and gave the press conference with his staff after the Arab hospital was bombed on, like, the 15th of October, 14th of October, 2023. And, you know, he's been kind of present in this Glasgow space. And he was talking a lot about how, like, the refusal of divestment from universities is just because they want to present themselves as a supporting empire through arms. At the basis, that's the only rationale left to refuse divestment. And so I'm like, maybe that's That's the other kind of refusal, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, we've been significantly influenced, inspired by the kind of Miltonian undercommons formulation, right? And part of it is to say that all of these logics around visibility, identity, these representation, they also feel really overdetermined. Like, I'm thinking about the last 10 years as well, right? Like, lots of things feel really overdetermined in relation to transness. And also we see this problem of the encoding, right? So we're talking about separability, and part of the argument that we make in the book is that separability is this really functioning as part of a bureaucratic grammar where gender is, or sex or whatever, has remained delimited as like something that's underlying the foundations of how a nation state has to understand itself and its citizens or whatever, its subjects in that formal sense. And thus, this is why it has to continue on documents. And in all of this, and then we have this like struggle for non-binary legal recognition, which is kind of like part of the underlying stuff that led to this kind of situation in the UK, right? Which is to do with what the Scottish government are trying to put through. And there's a whole fucking backstory around that. I'm going to spare us going into it, but I can tell you that another time if anyone actually is interested. So part of it is like, also in the grammar of encoding these things in recognizable legal terms or whatever is also just going to be reductive and diminish the degrees of potentiality, because it's like, if you've got a label to figure out yourself, sure, it's maybe doing a lot of work for you, but part of the power of figuring out through marginalization, it is this deep qualitative sense of like what it means to be in the world, right? That can't be reduced to a single categorical understanding. And so part of it is not just about the refusal of categories. It's to say like, oh, actually, it's to refuse the logics that those categories, the logics of assumption made around those categories in the grammar of understanding. And that could be like, because we're talking about this in some kind of, in an abstract social way. But what we've actually seen recently here is how reductive the conversation in the law is about trans people, right? That it has to literally be framed through the most transphobic language you can manage. And that's nothing new, right? This is always how it goes. Even when they turn out to do something that's seemingly progressive towards LGBT rights, it still occurred through this like horrific bastardization of the ways that we live, right?
Yeah.
And this shifting of the like, we also don't want to let the shortcuts function because there's not necessarily fun in the shortcuts. Or there might be, but the only fun that can be had through the shortcuts doesn't happen above ground.
Yeah, I think, like, I liked also what you said as trans as material disruption. I think you're really onto something there. Because I think one of the battles we see now, I think the right wing secretly really is relieved that there's trans people around because they are so clearly, you can so point at them so clearly and then project all kinds of things on them. And so they can shine this reactionary light. That is why we morph into this weird elements in the ruling, the Supreme Court ruling in the UK that makes a claim about the functioning of sex in the Equality Act, but that's all it does. And it does it in a way that is quite painful to read. Not painful because trans people are harassed in the ruling, even though they are, but because the ruling is so mind-bogglingly bizarre that it in fact hurts your mind to go like, how did they come up with these statements? Because they make no sense. I studied some analytical philosophy, and if you have some form of logical reasoning and you follow this reading, oh, there it says this person is a she and therefore a woman because she can get pregnant. She is meant in this way, and that's what it means. You go like, this is not real, people. It's definitely not how language works. It's definitely not how identity works. It's definitely not what people do in real life. So you see this kind of things happen. And on the other hand, you have this material disruption that can be really used for liberation. And I think this is really true. And I think a lot of people, this is why I think the trans movement is so strong. And it's not only carried by trans people at this moment, is because the moment trans people show up and people start to, and that's that relationality part that we write about, people start to also adjust to them and make links and connect, then suddenly the materiality of the space has shifted and people deal with it. And I think that is one of the things that we write about in the book is that quite often like equality and diversity policies, they don't do so much. But what actually does a lot is how people link to each other on the shop floor. And that is where liberation can happen, or also where it doesn't happen, right? If there's harassment.
Can I just jump in and say, like, that is the moment when trans practices get opened up?
Yeah.
That's exactly what makes talking about. It's
Yeah.
like these moments of like, oh, this person in this space reveals something that otherwise wasn't necessarily conceivable in that space.
Yeah.
Trans isn't we're not the only people or
No.
agents who do that, but like that's part of the function of difference, right?
Yeah. And then, like, for instance, whenever I had just moved to Amsterdam, I had to go and buy cheese in a new place. And I went to the market to the same cheese center, and there was this really grumpy farmer from the north of Amsterdam, and he was selling that, and he constantly saw me there every week. Like, it was a bit like, okay, he would sell me this cheese, and a bit like, but yeah, you show up, and then at some point when it's very cold, you go like, are you okay? It's a bit cold today. When it's very hot, you go, are you okay? It's a bit hot today. And like people get used to you. And at some point there were these two like sort of upper middle class people in his stand. And they made kind of to him a derogatory comment about me, sort of misgendering me. And this guy was like really there. I don't see that. What I see there is a woman. And then he looked at me and gave me this nod. And it is such a small thing, but it's also something that you go like, hey, look, it is literally grumpy farmers from the countryside above Amsterdam. There can just be our pals, And more than that is sometimes not needed, right? That is the difference without separability, because he obviously didn't want to be sucked along to this upper middle class people that used me to sort of create a fake bond. And I think that is the coolness of the transness as material disruption, because it also allowed him actually to tell me, yeah, you're welcome here. You're now part of my crew here. And that is also kind of like the beauty of that disruption that a certain trans body allows.
I wanted to move from this question of, material disruption. Part of the materiality of transness is access to healthcare. And that's another place that you talk about in terms of solidarity, because it's not simply like trans care, but all access to care. And this is another place where you have to interact with an institution on two levels, which is like what the institution is demanding from you and like what you're actually needing. And like transness is also this experience of an outside community that helps you in relationship to this access. If you have that kind of community, I know a lot of people are like, transition in isolation or don't have people, but I just mean there's like a parallel where we take care of each other. So I was just thinking about that, and I don't want to necessarily focus specifically on, access to surgery and hormones, but how you say that like trans relation to medical care is a larger question of healthcare, another place of solidarity. And I think it is like clearly a material part of our struggles.
Yeah. And I think because I think one of the things that I've at least seen in the communities around me is also the splitting up of this dichotomy about the institutional care and then the community access, right? Which is partly to do with the degree of failure of institutional care. And I guess it's like, is it care or is it even treatment, even if you can access it, right? Just because the system in the UK around the NHS is like, we're at this point basically where trans healthcare was like systematically underfunded in terms of the increase of people trying to access it. COVID-19 happened, everything got slowed down. Since then, there's been some attempts in some places to try and address provision. But waiting lists are still basically like, I think between 2 to 10 years, depending where you are, 1.5 to 10 years, depending where you are. And mostly in the like 3 to 7 year range, right? And then obviously like this time is also different depending on how old you are. That's also a thing, right? And so next to that is just like the community collective provision of healthcare has just become the thing that exists in spite of, with respect to this kind of failure of institutional care. But that's not to say that it exists purely in relation to it, because it also, there's a whole degree of other promises around how you might want to change your body, or what you might want to do with your body. And that are also not kind of caught up in this kind of cis-normative gender framework that the clinic actually runs, right?
Yeah.
And so that, I think that's like, we're talking quite a lot about grammar, right? But it's to say like the kinds of transition pathways that are available through the clinic in the UK are also really limited. And actually, most people are living their lives in some kind of excess of those limits, or find that they go along with the limits only to discover later that they maybe had more choice than it was suggested to them that they had, which is to do with like a lack of medical knowledge more than anything. And when I say a lack of medical knowledge, I actually mean that in the sense of like the pathways are also kind of encoded through this, like this is the way it has to be done because we're worried about these other things, including doctors getting sued. But hey, and then to say actually the community, it's a lack in relation to what the community knows, I should say. So it's like, it's not necessarily in this lack of like, there isn't a medical basis, which is also what the past report argued, right? That there isn't enough evidence, quote unquote, around if these treatments are safe, quote unquote. And it's like, oh no, just the way you frame evidence and the way that you disregard other evidence means that you're left with no evidence. And then next that is like, actually, no, the trans community knows we know loads of shit about how our bodies work or what is possible and what isn't possible with them. And we're also figuring that out, which is also to say like a lot of it's to do with kind of more formal questions around access. And also even like access to fundraising to crowdfund as well, you know, because crowdfunding becomes a means of working through accessing treatment privately, but it's also kind of conditioned by other class and other dynamics around class and race, but especially around class already. In all of this is some other vision of like, cool, there are things that we can do. Different problems arise from the mutual aid, self-organized approach. But those problems are not insurmountable either. And that's actually what's really given me hope in like 2025. I'm like, oh, cool. There were these problems. And now some people have found some ways to address those problems. And then it just becomes the next stage of building up community-based healthcare, which is actually kind of what's needed. Because it's like, it maybe doesn't have to be institutionalized, but it having a slightly more formal structure maybe does actually make it better. I'm not to say informal is... or maybe it doesn't get better. Maybe it becomes safer in certain ways that it might be otherwise, you know, there might be more risk. But it's different also because in the informal, there is also other degrees of possibility, both in terms of things that are available, but also things that might be harmful.
We're just starting a new project I'm starting a project with Tuna Erdem and Sarah Ergul. I live in Tower Hamlets in the east of London. And one of the things we know is that people that hit the menopause get the same medication as trans femmes get. It's literally the same substance. For instance, it's my estrogel. But what we found out in Tower Hamlets, and it's partly because it happened to our friends, is that in the menopause, people of color have different symptoms than white people. So for white people, hot flushes are a really big thing. And so GPs here are waiting to hear hot flushes, and then they will give hormones. But because my friend never got hot flushes, she never got hormones. And she ended up with a heart condition because of it. Simply because the GP didn't want to listen to a really easily prescribed hormone for people in menopause. And so what we're now going to do is we bring the people of color that are in the menopause into our hamlets in conversation with each other about their symptoms and about what they know. And we bring them in conversation together with trans communities in the borough in order to facilitate both this knowledge exchange, but also to bring the artificial separation between these two groups to a halt. Because there's also this thing that the Office of National Statistics was, wait, what? This is not possible. There live more trans people in Tower Hamlets than do in Brighton. And Brighton is so famously known as the queer-friendly city in the UK. And so what they said is that, it is probably these poor Muslim women that don't understand the question about transness, yes or no. So they use their racism in order to stop funds going to trans communities, right? Because that is what national statistics do. So we want to tackle both these things in the same go, basically because two groups get the same shit medical care. And what we know together is so much more than what medical professionals are willing to offer us. And so this is one of the projects where I think it shows that it's not just about, medical care as a trans person is difficult, even if it is, but it is difficult across a range of people. And together we can really lift each other up in a very helpful way.
Yeah, I think focusing on medical access as a point of attack, similarly to abortion in the US, is a way to really narrow the political playing field so that people just show up on this one terrain. And then, you can't think of the possible connections between different struggles, like where abortion and access to hormones also connect in some way.
Also, abortion and access for trans people. AJ Lowick, who is writing in Canada, makes really, really good points about this. How difficult it is, and even to get it funded. for trans people to have abortion access. It is really important.
Yeah. Okay. So we've been talking for a long time, and rather than, taking too much out of you, I thought maybe we can move towards what you do at the end of the book is like kind of invite people in, and you emphasize not only care, but like the affect of joy instead of like kind of taking on simply rage against all these terrible ways that we're being killed and treated. So I was wondering if you could just maybe iterate here a little bit of what joy means to you and the invitation that you leave the reader with at the end of the book. And also if you want to talk about this in context of the response you've been getting as you've been sharing the work around the world.
Yeah. Part of it is a question around like, why have a politics liberation? What are we actually trying to get? What space are we trying to eke open? And it's also partly this refusal of this deferral of the utopian horizon of liberation. Like your day will come or your time will come or whatever. And it's like, no, actually like part of what feminists really brings to the table are these questions of pleasure and engagement in the world and the sensorial. We write about this a lot at the beginning of the book, but like joy is also kind of key in this. It's also like trying to not just say this in a way that comes out as like some kind of aphorism that's not very interesting, but like joy has a function of opening up worlds as well, of opening up what's possible, of making life or existence in its moments feel worthwhile, right? There's also something to say about like, I don't want to say it's an end in itself, but it is part of what puts water back in the ground of like why we do the work that we do.
Yeah, because I think like one of the things that is so contrary to a lot of theory books that write about bodies a bit in the abstract. I think writing the book was very physical. We often went on walks, but it's also theorized really physically. And, a body can easily consume itself in rage and then you burn out and there's nothing gained with that, right? It's just dangerous and a dangerous practice. And one of the things I really love that Nat already put on the table, like joy opens up. And I think, like, for instance, Dario Fo, as a political theater maker, was always like, yeah, I make people laugh so the message gets in. But what it also does, joy also replenishes. It gives people a sense to relax. It gives people an openness. And in this sensorial openness, you can also explore how you actually want to live and what kind of new worlds you want to be sliding into that are not already prescribed by, again, there we go, identity categories, formal structures of relations, what counts as polite in what kind of space, but yet you can also break things because the openness allows you to just move in a different way, literally move. And then so I think by putting joy as the basis of solidarity rather than the more sort of like constrained, like, oh, we stand with those that are more oppressed than we are, you build automatically a space where you can connect across the difference as a form of pleasure. It is so joyful to be with in a space, right? It's joyful to be with each other.
There's a word in there which is also thinking about creativity in resistance and in building solidarity as well, right? Which I think anger or rage can also feed into. And actually that's constructive. That think about what have been the dynamics that have led some of the major uprisings that we've witnessed in the last 10, 15 years, right? If not before as well, right? Rage and anger have a really key function. But
Absolutely.
I think part of what we're trying to do is also unpack it from, say, the individual into the collective or into the social. And, we have a lot of like individual versus institution. Individual's always going to lose. You're going to get burnt out. You're going to get destroyed. The institution is going to make you feel rageful. But we're also, I guess part of it is to say like, oh yeah, there is so much pleasure. There is a degree of joy that comes from the affirmation of trans existence.
Yeah.
And it's not just so you have to affirm trans people to make them feel good, but we do the things that we do because they feel good. And I think that's also part of this challenge of also countering, oh, whoa, it's so fucking hard. Like, sure, it sucks to be oppressed. Like, oppression is fucking brutal. But like, we also do this because we want to do this. Like, so basically, one of the best books on trans that's been written in the UK in the last few years is a book by Travis Alabanza called None of the Above. And it's like a kind of, if you haven't read this book, it's kind of like, I would say it's like critical memoir, but it's also really readable. Travis is a theater maker, This book is basically written as monologue. And Travis spends loads of time unpacking forms of violence that they experience as like a gender nonconforming Black femme, right? But like in all of it is this pleasure. And I think Make pulled this line into our book, which is, this is for us, baby. And it's this sense of, oh yeah, actually we do this because we want to do this. And like, I think there's so much fucking pleasure and resistance, even when we're fighting stuff that's really hard. Like we're recording this in the middle of June in 2025. Like at Edinburgh Pride last year, we had a radical bloc. It was really built on the back of the Palestine Solidarity Movement. as like exactly a year ago this week, right? We had our fucking massive pink washing line that my comrades made. But like part of it is in that moment of coming together and claiming radical political space, even in a pride parade, even in a fucking pride parade, there is so much pleasure in this moment of coming together. And actually, like part of the problem in the left in the UK, and I actually, whenever I see videos of moments of resistance and protest in North America or on Turtle Island, I'm like, wow, you guys have a way more interesting political culture than we do. Because basically none of the chants of any rhythm, protests are generally not creative. No one's having a good time, like it's that whole like make the revolution irresistible thing. Was like, let's have a good time whilst we're really angry. Because we're all at least here together for the reasons we might be grieving. I'm not saying grieving is pleasure. I'm not saying violence is pleasure. I'm not saying it's pleasure when the police turn up and try and attack you with the riot vans or whatever. So it's this mix of like, in the moment of coming together and also in these moments of the everyday. It's kind of interesting because so much trans social organizing recently is just like casual stuff. Like there's people just doing collective organizing so they can do exercise together. And like, that's cool too. Like,
for instance, I do the Big Ride for Palestine in London. Like we meet extremely regularly. I can't make it every time, but I go very regularly. And one of the things why it's so joyful is because we're all on bikes, cycling through London, blowing our whistles, shouting slogans all together. And like shouting slogans all together is great because it makes people to connect to each other. But it's also already happening in that movement, right? So when you notice it, it is so much energy that goes out and it becomes a very strong community in that sense. And I think that movement and the pleasure, and that can be protest as joy, but it can also be protest as anger, is really one of the ways. You need the rage to keep the norms at a distance and to fight them, but you need the joy to build trust in each other. And I think that is what these joyful moments do, that people really start to trust each other and get deep.
I love that. Like, I try to think of refusal not simply as like a negation, but this opening up for space, sort of like what you were talking about. And I find that really beautiful. So you said before we started recording that this book is not specifically of this time, but is very connected to this time, and that people have found it really helpful and, not just mired in the despair that we're feeling right now. So thank you so much for bringing this book into the world and inviting us into thinking this with you and trying to embody it.
Yeah. And thanks for also reflecting on that. Before we started recording, I was saying I feel really grateful to be talking and thinking through this work now and to have something that's constructively optimistic. So much of the book's also just about trying to do collective organizing with each other or trying to survive institutions in a way that, doesn't just immediately leave one burnt out. And yeah, it feels like that's also the work in terms of trying to find ways to work together, trying to work through these things. And it's something also about like how these kinds of disruptions, also interruptions, I should say, in relation to trans kind of also feed our analysis of that. And that's like, yeah, it's just the hope that there are other ways to do things. And I mean, sometimes it's also just like some of our closest readers are just like our friends, right? But those friends are involved in trying to do organizing, be it around transformative justice, be it whatever, they're on some committee for some arts organization. It's cool because they're just like, we're trying to figure out how to make an approach out of the ideas that are here, be that around complicity, be that around embracing friction, and leaning into friction. Because also like, all these cultures are different, but like there's so much here that is really avoidant. And actually the kinds of political contestations that we've been talking about, be that Palestine solidarity, but also in terms of like protests, like all the protests around trans liberation, trans rights at the moment. And, there's still things that's still being worked out, right? That grammar and that difference. They're the moments of contestation. And we're trying to say like, actually, no, there's also loads of moments of contestation that happen in our spaces, happen in our private houses, happen in these community spaces, they happen in the bar. And that's where the ground needs to change. I mean, I feel very hopeful also in the sense of we see how the language of like less trans, abolitionist, feminist organizing has taken up trans solidarity. And that's been really pronounced in the past couple of months as well, in a way that it hasn't previously felt so pronounced. I wouldn't say it hasn't been pronounced before, but it hasn't felt so pronounced. And the kinds of outpourings of solidarity in different ways. And I mean, that's like, given we're on a podcast, it's like things look bad here, but also I think this social movement's an iron in the fire for a long time. And that's, and it's like, sure, like the institutions are fucked, like Supreme Court rulings fucked. The Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is currently they're trying to figure out how to implement the ruling, right? They've got this faux consultation process. Everyone's pouring loads of energy into the consultation, but every day I'm like, should I go on Instagram and be like, hey, yeah, consultations are just neoliberal listening exercise where they kind of suck all your energy and then they do whatever the fuck they want. That's how they work. That's what's going to happen next. But next to all these institutional stuff, the community organizing is really powerful. And it's like, there's a real chance to just like affirm trans solidarity in ways that haven't happened before. And so that's also what gives me hope, is that these kinds of degrees of what solidarity looks like can be different, because in the past, it's been tokenistic and it's allowed for all these divisions to remain in our communities, in our radical communities, in our self-organized spaces. And that's really where we need to start unpacking these things. And it takes time, right? I think we're talking about separability and, this whole like migrants, refugees, people with no recourse to public funds, it's called here as well. It's like, sure, that the othering falls apart after time when it's like, oh no, there's plenty of these people in our community as well. Right? Like, they're just here. Like, that's my friend. Or they're our students, And it's like, as time unfolds and as these boundaries permeate with each other and we get to know each other, that is also the shifts that need to happen. It's also just exhausting when it's also trying to challenge these cultures of whiteness or the cultures of kind of a cis-normativity that reemerge in different ways as well. It's my like hopeful political ramble.
Yeah, thanks for bringing us together in the podcast, Julie. I think what happened with the book, what I really enjoyed, is that some of the ideas we put out allowed us to have a lot of conversations in a lot of different spaces. And so I keep learning new things about the book, and I keep learning new things about all the spaces we're visiting because of the questions and the conversations that have happened. But what I also see is that some of the things we put out, like for instance, a theory of people becoming managers, and not just your managers, but people in spaces, in self-organized spaces, becoming management, is very important because we see the attitude a lot. And we see, because we notice that people start to recognize it very fast when we start to talk about it and how it emerges. And I think that has been very heartening, because sometimes when you write a book and you're 4 years, you're sort of in and out. And then suddenly when you throw the book into the world, you see the things coming back that you didn't just make it up. You're gaslighting yourself or something. And it came forth out of like decades of organizing, and it came forth out of being part of failing and successful collectives, being part of collectives that we managed to hold on to each other, and collectives that fell apart, and all have been necessary. And I think partly that is also what the book and the joy that we got in the reception of the book, that it, for some people, it really does something. And that is really pleasant to sit with people for who it does something, and then to see what kind of new knowledge we are building and what people are building with each other in the moment. And I think that has been incredible in the last months.
Well, thank you so much for giving me so much time. And I invite everyone to read this book. It has this kind of effect on you to generate excitement for the possibility of forming relations and collective together. Thank you again. And
thanks, Julie.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much for the conversation and for your reading book.
You've been listening to The Breakup Theory. As always, if you like the show, please rate and follow us wherever you get it, and tell your friends they need to break up. Bye.